In Tokyo, a home is something you live in, then let go of. It gets older, cheaper, and eventually replaced. No one expects it to make them rich. Meanwhile, in America, a house is not considered a shelter. It's a bet, a retirement plan, a line on a balance sheet that must never go down. Both systems work exactly as designed, and that's why one country has affordable housing and the other has a permanent crisis that never seems to end. Tokyo spreads like a living circuit board, 38 million people moving through a grid that never stops adapting. More people than all of Canada concentrated into one metropolitan organism, dense, organized, relentless. And yet, housing there doesn't spiral out of control the way it does here in America. Not because Tokyo is small, not because it's stagnant, but because somewhere in the architecture of how the city thinks about shelter, something fundamental is different. Meanwhile, in Austin, in Denver, in Raleigh, cities a fraction of Tokyo's size, housing tightens every year. Prices climb, inventory thins, the whole system feels like it's holding its breath. This isn't about better planning or worse greed, it's about what housing was allowed to become. In Japan, a home built in 1985 is old, tired, something to be replaced. In America, that same home is considered vintage, charming, an asset appreciating by $500,000. One country treats housing like a car, the other treats it like gold. This didn't happen by accident. If you were to walk through certain neighborhoods in Tokyo today, you'd see construction everywhere. Not gentrification in the American sense, not old buildings being converted into lofts, just buildings coming down and going back up. 30-year-old apartments are being replaced with new ones, offices turned into residential towers. The city is rebuilding itself in real time. This isn't because Tokyo is booming in some unprecedented way, it's because this is what Tokyo has always done. The Great Kanto earthquake in 1923 killed over 100,000 people. It flattened the city. Then the firebombing campaigns of 1945 did it again. Tokyo was erased twice in a generation. When you rebuild from ash twice, something changes in how you think about permanence. Japanese cities didn't develop a philosophical attachment to impermanence. They developed a practical one. Buildings don't last. They shouldn't be expected to. What lasts is land. And land doesn't need to be protected from supply, because you can't make more of it anyway. So Japan's building codes, its cultural habits, its tax structures all quietly reinforced the same idea. Structures wear out. Newness is better than age. Homes depreciate. This isn't nostalgia, it's repetition as memory. And it created a housing system where supply is allowed to respond. When demand rises in a Tokyo neighborhood, someone can build. Not after years of community input sessions and zoning appeals, just build. The regulations exist, they're strict about safety, about density in some areas, but they don't exist to freeze the city in place. Japan's zoning is national, set by the central government. Local neighborhoods can't vote to ban apartments. They can't mandate that every lot be 2 acres. The shape of the city is not decided by the people who already own homes in it. So Tokyo grows, not outward into sprawl, but upward and inward, filling gaps, replacing old structures with new ones. Housing supply moves. And housing prices, while not cheap, don't compound into the kind of crisis that defines American cities, because the system was never asked to do anything else. Maybe you're watching this late, second screen while something else plays, or maybe it's morning where you are and you're already thinking about rent, about mortgages, about whether moving even makes sense anymore. If this is landing somewhere familiar, I'm glad you're here. America's story doesn't begin with villainy. It begins with a promise. After World War II, the United States was the wealthiest nation on earth. Its cities were intact, its factories were running, and it made a choice to build outward. The suburban expansion wasn't a conspiracy, it was a policy. Highways are funded by the federal government, mortgages backed by the federal government, tax deductions that made homeownership the center of the middle-class life. The promise was stability, a yard, a garage, a place that would hold value, a shelter that could also be savings. And for a long time, for a lot of people, it worked. But the architecture of that promise had boundaries. Even after the Fair Housing Act of 1968 made racial discrimination in housing illegal, exclusion didn't vanish. It reorganized. Zoning became more specific. Lot sizes grew. Single-family homes became mandatory across vast swaths of suburban land, not because of race, not explicitly, but because of character, because of congestion, because of protecting property values. The language was clean. The effect was the same. Scarcity became encoded, and scarcity, over time, became valuable. This is where the systems quietly separate. In Japan, a homeowner expects their house to lose value. They expect the structure to depreciate like a car over 20, maybe 30 years. What holds value is the land underneath. In America, a homeowner expects the opposite. The house should be worth more in 10 years than it is today. The land matters, sure, but the whole package, structure and all, is supposed to appreciate. This difference is not cultural decoration, it's structural. Because once housing becomes an asset expected to grow in value, the incentives flip. Homeowners stop wanting more housing, they start wanting protection. They attend zoning meetings, they hire lawyers, they argue against apartments, against density, against anything that might increase supply. Not because they're cruel, but because they're rational. Their wealth is in that house, and wealth stored in scarcity needs scarcity to survive. There was a moment when this logic locked in harder. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 changed how real estate was taxed in the United States. Before that, owning rental properties could generate significant tax shelters through depreciation and passive loss deductions. Real estate was a way to generate income while reducing taxable income elsewhere. The 1986 reform closed many of those loopholes. It limited passive loss deductions, it made real estate less attractive as a tax strategy for income. But it didn't kill real estate investment, it shifted it. If you couldn't harvest income and tax benefits the old way, you needed a different return: appreciation. So housing shifted from something that generated cash flow to something that generated value growth. The investment model changed, the incentives changed. And appreciation requires scarcity. You can't have every asset in a class appreciate indefinitely if supply keeps expanding. Appreciation needs constraint. It needs protection. This wasn't sudden, but over the decades that followed, housing policy and housing investment began to align around a single idea: keep supply tight. Not as a conspiracy, as an equilibrium. Japan, meanwhile, was dealing with something else entirely. Its population peaked in 2008, then it started shrinking. Fewer people means less demand. Less demand should mean lower prices. And in much of rural Japan, it does. There are villages where homes are abandoned, where you can buy a house for nearly nothing because no one wants to live there. But Tokyo keeps growing. People leave the countryside and move to the city. Demand concentrates. Yet even in Tokyo, supply responds, because the system allows it to. Developers can build. They do build. And when they build, prices soften. Not collapse, soften. Because supply is doing what supply does when it's allowed to move. America's cities don't have a shrinking population. They have the opposite problem. People want to live in Denver, in Austin, in Portland, in Nashville. Demand is high. Jobs are there. Culture is there. But supply doesn't respond the same way. Because zoning won't let it. Because homeowners vote. Because housing isn't just shelter anymore. It's retirement. It's collateral. It's how wealth transfers across generations. So even when demand surges, supply stays constrained. And prices do what prices do when demand rises and supply doesn't. You can see this in how America's housing market responded to the last few years. Interest rates were near zero. Prices surged. People borrowed cheap money and bought everything they could. Then the Federal Reserve raised rates. Mortgages went from 3% to 7%. Economists predicted a crash. If borrowing costs septupled, demand should collapse. Prices should fall. They didn't. They paused. They softened in some markets, but they didn't break. Because a growing share of homes aren't owned by people who need to sell. They're owned by investors, by funds, by landlords who bought properties as long-term holds. These owners don't have to sell when rates rise. They can wait. They can raise rent. They can sit on inventory and let appreciation do the work. The system didn't break. It stabilized around scarcity. Japan's market has seen pressure too. Tokyo's housing prices have risen in recent years. Inflation, global capital, foreign investment, all of it flowing into a city that remains one of the safest bets in Asia. But the system bends differently. Prices rise, developers respond, supply increases, pressure disperses. It doesn't always work perfectly. There are expensive neighborhoods, there are people priced out, but the system doesn't lock. It flexes, because it was never built to protect scarcity. Some American cities are beginning to shift. Minneapolis ended single-family zoning. Portland allowed more density. California passed laws forcing cities to permit more housing. These aren't small changes, they're structural, but they meet resistance. Not from cartoons of greed, but from ordinary homeowners who watch their largest asset and worry that more supply means less value. They're not wrong to worry. In a system where housing is wealth, more housing is a threat. And here's the quiet part. The resistance is funded by the appreciation itself. Homeowners who've seen their property values double can afford lawyers, consultants, and political donations. They can slow things down. They can wait. When wealth is stored in scarcity, reform meets resistance funded by appreciation itself. This isn't corruption, it's alignment. I don't know where you're watching this from. Maybe you're in Tokyo, maybe you're in Ohio, maybe you're somewhere else entirely, dealing with the same pressure under a different name. If you're finding something useful here, I'd appreciate you letting me know in the comments where you're watching from, whether this matches what you're seeing or experiencing. And if you'd like to support this kind of work, please consider liking and sharing this video and also subscribing to the channel. Let's continue. Demographics don't explain the whole gap. Yes, Japan's population is shrinking. Yes, that reduces demand in some places. But Tokyo is still growing. Seattle is still growing. Both are wealthy, dense, desirable cities. The difference isn't in the demand, it's in what happens next. In Tokyo, demand triggers supply. In Seattle, demand triggers opposition. One system assumes housing will be built, the other assumes it will be protected. There's a strange trick the mind plays when you live inside a system long enough. You stop seeing it as a system, you start seeing it as nature. Housing is expensive becomes housing is expensive because that's how it is. But it's not nature, it's design. Japan designed a system where homes lose value and supply can move. America designed a system where homes gain value and supply is constrained. Neither is inevitable, both are choices, accumulated over decades, embedded into law, defended by the people who benefit. At some point, shelter began doing another job. It became a store of wealth, a retirement plan, a way to transfer value to children who wouldn't be able to afford their own. And once that happened, the incentives changed. Because if your home is your savings account, you can't afford for it to lose value. You need it to grow. And growth in a market requires scarcity. So scarcity becomes policy. Policy becomes culture. Culture becomes common sense. Until someone visiting from Tokyo wonders why a city of 2 million people has a housing shortage. This wasn't sudden. It hardened over time. Through zoning meetings no one attended, through tax reforms no one noticed, through 1,000 small decisions that all pointed in the same direction, toward protection, toward appreciation, toward housing as investment instead of housing as shelter. Japan made different choices, not better ones necessarily, just different. They made choices that assumed buildings wouldn't last, that newness mattered more than preservation, that supply should move when demand moves. And now, decades later, the results are visible. Not perfect, not utopian, just different. America didn't fail at housing. It succeeded at turning shelter into an asset. It succeeded in creating a system where homeowners could store wealth, access credit, and retire comfortably. For millions of people, it worked. But that success required scarcity, and scarcity has costs. Japan simply never asked housing to do that job.
Homes were allowed to be homes, temporary, replaceable, depreciating, and because of that, they stayed closer to shelter. Not cheaper always, not easier always, but available. Because the system never locked, it kept moving. Maybe that's all this is. One country lets housing stay fluid, the other made it solid, and now we're living in what that produces.